The blacksmith's hammer rang 3 times against the anvil before Yannick Barrow heard the laughter high, cruel and familiar in the way children's mockery always was when they found something weaker than themselves to tear down. He set the horseshoe aside and wiped sweat from his brow, stepping to the open door of his forge just as a stone sailed past a small green face, missing by inches. The orc girl could not have been more than 6 years old, her tusks barely nubs against her lower lip, her black hair braided with ribbons that had probably been bright once, but were now mud-splattered and frayed. She stood in the center of the village green with her small fists clenched at her sides, tears cutting clean tracks down her dusty cheeks while a half-dozen human children circled her like wolves. "Bastard!" one of the boys crowed, perhaps 11 and already mean in the eyes. "Monster bastard with no da. My mama says your kind breed like animals," a girl added, her voice sing-song with viciousness. "Says your father was probably just passing through and did not even know your mama's name." The orc girl's mouth trembled, but she said nothing, and Yannick felt something old and tired shift in his chest. He had seen plenty of cruelty in his 32 years, had dealt some of it himself in the war, back when he wore the king's colors and swung a sword instead of a hammer. But there was something particularly ugly about watching children learn to hate. "I do have a da," the girl whispered, so quiet Yannick almost missed it. "My mama said your mama's a liar," the mean-eyed boy interrupted. "Everyone knows orcs do not have proper families. You are just enough." The word came from Yannick's throat before he had consciously decided to speak, rough and flat as an anvil strike, and the children startled like rabbits. He stepped out into the afternoon sun, still wearing his leather apron, soot streaking his forearms and sweat dampening his shirt. He was not a large man by soldier standards, perhaps 6 feet, broad through the shoulders from years at the forge, but leaner now than he had been in his army days. But he carried himself with the kind of stillness that made people think twice. The children scattered like seeds on the wind, all except the mean-eyed boy who lingered long enough to shoot Yannick a sullen glare before turning and running after his friends. The village green emptied quickly, leaving only the small orc girl standing alone in a patch of churned mud, her whole body shaking with the effort of not sobbing aloud. Yannick had seen that kind of shaking before, in young soldiers after their first battle, that desperate attempt to hold dignity together when everything inside was breaking apart. He walked slowly across the green, his boots squelching in the mud, and when he was perhaps 5 paces away, the girl's eyes snapped up to his face, dark amber, bright with tears and something fiercer underneath. "Are you going to tell me to leave too?" she asked, and her voice was steadier than he had expected. "No," Yannick said simply. He came closer, then did something he had not planned, something that surprised him even as he dropped to one knee in the mud so that his eyes were level with hers. Up close, he could see the slight greenish tint to her tears, the way her pointed ears lay flat against her skull in distress, the careful mending on her dress that spoke of a mother who cared. "I am going to tell you that those children are fools, and that having no father does not make you worth less than anyone. But I do have a da," she insisted, and now the tears spilled over despite her best efforts. "Mama said he was a soldier, and he died before I was born, and he was brave and good," and her voice broke. And Yannick felt something crack open inside his chest, some long sealed chamber he had kept locked since the war ended, and he had returned to this quiet border village to make horseshoes and gate hinges and occasionally a fancy iron railing for the mayor's house. He thought of the men he had known, good men who had died in mud not so different from this, men who had never met the children their wives carried, men whose names their sons and daughters would only ever know from stories. Then he was a lucky man, Yannick said quietly, to have a daughter so fierce she will stand and defend his memory even when the world is cruel. The girl stared at him, amber eyes wide and shining, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then footsteps, quick and purposeful, and a voice that carried the kind of exhaustion that came from working too hard and sleeping too little. Gretchen. The orc woman who hurried across the green was perhaps 25, her green skin darker than her daughter's, her tusks more pronounced but still small enough to be almost delicate. She wore a plain work dress and an apron stained with what looked like berry juice, her black hair pulled back in a thick braid, and her face was tight with the kind of worry that turned quickly to relief, and then, just as quickly, to wariness, when she saw Yannick kneeling beside her child. "Gretchen, come here," she said, extending a hand, and the girl Gretchen ran to her mother and buried her face against her hip. The woman's eyes never left Yannick's face, measuring him with the kind of careful assessment that prey animals used when deciding whether to run or freeze. "Did this man bother you?" "No, Mama," Gretchen said, her voice muffled. The children were saying things again and he made them stop. The wariness in the woman's face did not ease, but something flickered their gratitude, perhaps, or maybe just the bone-deep weariness of a woman who had heard too many cruel things said about her child, and had no power to stop them all. Yannick stood slowly, brushing mud from his knee, and found himself meeting her gaze directly. She was pretty, he realized with some surprise, in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or conventional standards, and everything to do with the fierce dignity in the set of her jaw, the strength in the arm she wrapped protectively around her daughter, the intelligence in her dark amber eyes that matched Gretchen's exactly. "Thank you," she said after a moment, the words careful and formal. "I am Lissa Joran. This is my daughter Gretchen." "Yannick Barrow," he replied. "The blacksmith." He hesitated, then added, "The children were being cruel. I only said what any decent person would." Lissa's mouth tightened, and he realized she had probably heard that excuse before. That casual dismissal that suggested decency was common when in her experience it clearly was not. She nodded once, then turned as if to leave, guiding Gretchen with a hand on her shoulder. Yannick should have let them go, should have returned to his forge and his horseshoe and his quiet, solitary life. Instead, he heard himself say, they were mocking her for having no father. Lissa went very still, her back to him, and even from 5 paces away, Yannick could see the tension that ran through her shoulders. "Gretchen's father was a soldier," she said, her voice flat and careful. "He died honorably before she was born, not that it matters to people like them." "It should matter," Yannick said, and the words came out rougher than he intended. "A man who dies in service deserves to be remembered, and his child deserves respect." Lissa turned slowly, her amber eyes searching his face for mockery or pity or whatever other cruelty she had learned to expect. Yannick met her gaze steadily and saw the exact moment something shifted, some small crack in her armor of wariness. "Most people do not see it that way," she said quietly. "They see orc, and they see bastard, and they do not care about the truth." Gretchen sniffled against her mother's hip, and Lissa's hand moved automatically to smooth her daughter's hair, that unconscious gesture of comfort that mothers made. Yannick thought of his own mother, dead these 10 years, and the way she had smoothed his hair just like that when he was small, and the world felt too large and frightening. He looked at Gretchen, at her tear-streaked face and her muddy dress and her small shoulders still shaking with suppressed sobs, and made a decision that he did not fully understand even as the words left his mouth. "She does now." Both Lissa and Gretchen stared at him, confusion clear on their faces, and Yannick dropped to one knee again in the mud, this time looking directly at Gretchen with an intensity that made the girl's eyes go wide. "She has a father now," Yannick said, his voice carrying across the empty green, and he knew without looking that curtains were twitching in windows, that eyes were watching, that words were being spoken behind closed doors. "If those children mock you again, you tell them Yannick Barrow is your father, and if they have a problem with that, they can come to the forge and discuss it with me." Gretchen's mouth fell open, her small tusks visible, her amber eyes huge. Lissa made a sound like all the air had been punched from her lungs, her hand flying to her mouth. What are you saying?" she managed, her voice strangled. Yannick stood, his eyes moving from Gretchen to Lissa, and saw the terror there alongside something that might have been hope, and he understood in that moment the magnitude of what he had just done, the promise he had made, the binding declaration he had spoken in front of witnesses without even knowing these people's full story. "I am saying that no child should face the world alone," he said, quieter now but no less certain, "and that if you will permit it, I would like to know you both better." He paused, then added with careful honesty, "I have spoken rashly and presumptuously, and I apologize for that. But I do not take back the words. If you will allow it, I mean to make them true." Lissa was shaking her head, tears spilling down her cheeks now, and Yannick could not tell if they were tears of anger or grief or something else entirely. "You do not know us," she whispered. "You do not know anything about us. You cannot just people do not just," she broke off, her hand tightening on Gretchen's shoulder. "This is madness." "Probably," Yannick agreed. He took a step closer, then stopped when Lissa's eyes went wide and wary. "I am not asking for an answer now. I am only asking for a chance to prove I mean what I say." He looked down at Gretchen, who was staring at him like he had sprouted wings. "Would that be acceptable?" Gretchen looked up at her mother, her small face torn between hope and confusion, and Lissa closed her eyes and drew a long, shaking breath. When she opened them again, some of the terror had been replaced by a kind of desperate exhaustion. "Why?" she asked, and the word held years of hurt. "Why would you do this? What do you want from us?" It was a fair question, Yannick thought, and one he did not have a good answer for because he did not fully understand his own motives. He only knew that he had seen a child crying in the mud, had heard the echo of his own past in her story of a father lost to war, and had felt something wake in the hollow place where he had kept his heart, locked away for the last 8 years. "I want to prove that not everyone in this village is cruel," he said finally. "And I want," he paused, surprised by his own honesty, "I want to matter to someone again. I have been alone a long time and I am tired of it." Lissa's eyes searched his face, looking for deception, and Yannick let her look. He had nothing to hide, no ulterior motive beyond the simple, terrifying truth that he had seen this woman and her child and felt something shift inside him, some recognition of kinship or need or possibility. "I work at the grain house," Lissa said at last, her voice still wary but no longer quite so frightened. "Sorting and cleaning the harvest stores. I have little time and less money, and Gretchen is." She looked down at her daughter and her face softened. "She is everything to me, everything." "If you think you can use her to—" "No," Yannick interrupted, firm and clear. "I would never. On my honor as a soldier and a craftsman, I would never harm a child or use one as a tool. If you agree to let me know you, it will be on your terms and your pace, and the moment you tell me to stop, I will respect that." Gretchen tugged on her mother's dress, and when Lissa looked down, the girl whispered something too quiet for Yannick to hear. Lissa's face crumpled for just a moment before she smoothed it back to careful neutrality, and when she looked at Yannick again, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Gretchen says you were kind. she said quietly. She says you looked at her like she mattered. A pause. That does not happen often. Then the world is poorer for it, Yannick said, and meant it. Lissa laughed, a short, broken sound, then wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You are either the most genuine man I have ever met or the most skilled liar. She took a breath. I suppose time will tell which. I suppose it will, Yannick agreed. He waited, giving her space to decide, and after a long moment Lissa nodded slowly. You may visit us, she said, each word careful and deliberate. On seventh-day evenings after I finish work. We live in the small cottage past the mill, the one with the blue door. You may visit and we will talk, and I will decide if you are sincere. She paused, her amber eyes hard. But if you hurt my daughter, if you make promises you do not keep, if you are playing some game I do not understand, I will make you regret it. The threat should have sounded absurd coming from a woman who barely reached his shoulder. But Yannick heard the steel in her voice and recognized a warrior when he met one, even if her battles were fought with exhaustion and pride instead of swords. Understood, he said simply. Seventh-day evening. I will be there. Lissa nodded once more, then turned and guided Gretchen away across the green, their figures dark against the afternoon sun. Yannick watched them go and felt the weight of what he had done settle over his shoulders like a cloak, heavy and binding, and somehow right. Behind him, the forge fire was burning low, and he had a horseshoe to finish and a dozen other tasks waiting. But for the first time in 8 years, Yannick Barrow felt like he was doing something that mattered beyond survival, beyond the simple rhythm of heat and hammer and iron. He had made a promise to a child and a terrified mother, and now he would have to figure out how to keep it. The next 6 days passed with a strange, nervous energy that Yannick had not felt since his first battle. He worked the forge as always, shaping iron and steel for the village's needs, but his mind kept wandering to the small cottage past the mill, to amber eyes and black braids and a little girl's tear-streaked face. He found himself thinking about what to bring, what to say, how to prove he was serious without overwhelming them, and it occurred to him somewhere around the 4th day that this nervousness was not entirely unpleasant. He realized with some surprise, looking forward to 7th day with an anticipation he had not felt in years. When the evening finally arrived, Yannick closed the forge early and washed carefully in the rain barrel outside his workshop, scrubbing away the soot and sweat until his skin felt raw. He put on his cleanest shirt and combed his hair, which was getting long enough to need cutting, and tried to decide if he looked presentable or merely awkward. In the end, he gave up, grabbed the small basket he had prepared, and walked through the village as the sun sank low and golden over the fields. The cottage past the mill was easy to find, smaller than most but well kept, with a blue door that had been recently painted and a tiny garden plot where herbs grew in neat rows. Yannick knocked, 3 careful raps, and heard movement inside before the door opened to reveal Lissa, her work dress replaced by a simple green gown that brought out the depth of her skin tone, her hair still braided but with small white flowers tucked into the plait. She looked prettier than he remembered and more nervous, her hands twisting together in front of her before she caught herself and stilled them. "You came," she said, and he could not tell if she was relieved or disappointed. "I said I would," Yannick replied. He held up the basket. "I brought bread and cheese from the market and some honey." I thought I was not sure if he stopped, feeling suddenly foolish. I did not want to come empty-handed. Lissa's mouth softened just slightly, and she stepped back to let him in. The cottage was small but clean, with a hearth at one end, and a table with 3 mismatched chairs, a narrow bed in the corner that was clearly Gretchen's, and a curtained alcove that must have been Lissa's sleeping space. The walls were bare except for a single wooden carving of an oak tree, beautifully detailed, and everything smelled faintly of herbs and wood smoke. Gretchen sat at the table, her black hair freshly braided, wearing a dress that looked newer than the mud-stained one from the village green. She watched Yannick with wide, wary eyes, her small hands folded in her lap. "Hello, Gretchen," Yannick said, setting the basket on the table. "How have you been?" "Well, sir," Gretchen said quietly, very formal, and Yannick remembered what it was like to be a child meeting adults, the strange performance of manners that was expected. "You can call me Yannick," he said, pulling out one of the chairs and sitting down carefully. "Sir makes me feel old." Gretchen's mouth twitched, almost a smile, and Lissa moved to the hearth where a pot was simmering. "I made stew," she said, not quite looking at him. "It is simple, but you are welcome to share it if you like." "I would like that very much," Yannick said honestly. He watched as she ladled stew into 3 wooden bowls, her movements efficient and practiced. And when she brought them to the table, he saw that the stew was thick with vegetables and barley, probably no meat because meat was expensive, but it smelled good and warm and like someone cared enough to cook it well. They ate in awkward silence at first, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against wood and the crackle of the fire. Yannick searched for something to say that would not sound forced or foolish and finally settled on, "This is very good. Thank you for sharing it." "You brought bread and cheese," Lissa said a bit defensively. "It is a fair trade." "Even so." Yannick took another spoonful, then looked at Gretchen. "Have you had any more trouble with those children?" Gretchen shook her head quickly, her ears perking up a bit. "No, sir, I mean Yannick. They have been leaving me alone." She hesitated, then added in a whisper, "I think they are scared of you." "Good," Yannick said flatly, and was surprised when Lissa laughed, a real laugh this time, startled and genuine. "You should not encourage her to intimidate other children," she said, but there was no real reproach in her voice. "I am not encouraging intimidation," Yannick replied. "I am encouraging them to think twice before being cruel." He met Lissa's eyes across the table. "There is a difference." Lissa held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I suppose there is." She pushed her stew around her bowl, then said quietly, "I was not sure you would actually come. Most people who make grand gestures do not follow through." "I am not most people," Yannick said, and then felt foolish for how arrogant that sounded. "I mean, I do not make promises lightly. When I say something, I mean it." "And what exactly did you mean," Lissa asked, her voice very careful, "when you said she has a father now?" It was the question he had been expecting, the one he had been trying to figure out how to answer for 6 days. Yannick set down his spoon and looked at Gretchen, who was watching him with those wide amber eyes, then back at Lissa. "I meant that I want to be someone she can depend on," he said slowly, working through the words as he spoke them. "Someone who will stand between her and cruelty, who will teach her things and listen to her stories and be there when she needs help." "I meant," he paused, surprised by the tightness in his throat. "I meant that I want to be her father if you will both allow it. Not to replace the man who gave her life, but to be the man who helps her live it." Lissa's eyes were bright with tears again, her jaw tight, and Yannick could see her fighting to keep control. "You do not know what you are asking," she whispered. "Being a father is not just grand gestures and kind words. It is years of work and worry and sacrifice. It is putting someone else's needs before your own every single day. It is—" "I know," Yannick interrupted gently. "I was a soldier for 12 years. I know what it means to be responsible for someone else's life, to make sacrifices, to endure hardship for a purpose greater than myself." He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "I am not a young man looking for adventure or excitement. I am a man who has lived alone too long and who saw a chance to matter again, to be part of something good. I understand this will be hard. I am asking for the chance anyway." Lissa wiped her eyes roughly, then looked at Gretchen. "What do you think, little one?" Gretchen was very quiet, her small face serious, and when she spoke her voice was almost too soft to hear. "I think he seems nice, Mama, and I think," she swallowed hard, "I think I would like to have a da, if it could be someone kind." Yannick felt something break open in his chest, some old wound tearing wider even as it began, impossibly to heal. He had to look away for a moment, blinking hard, and when he looked back both Lissa and Gretchen were watching him with expressions he could not quite read. "I do not trust easily," Lissa said after a long silence. Gretchen's father, his name was Torvald, he was a good man, an orc man who fought for the king's army in the border wars. He died 3 months before she was born, killed by bandits while he was on patrol. Her voice was steady but hollow, the words worn smooth by repetition. "I loved him, and I have not let anyone close since he died because I could not bear to lose someone again, and because—" she stopped, her jaw working. "Because people in this village barely tolerate us. A relationship between an orc woman and a human man would be scandalous. You would face prejudice, scorn, possibly worse." "Let them scorn," Yannick said quietly. "I have faced worse things than gossip." "Have you?" Lissa challenged, her eyes hard. "Have you ever been spat on in the street, had people cross to the other side of the road to avoid you? Been told your very existence is an insult to decency?" "No," Yannick admitted. "But I have killed men in battle and watched friends die in mud, and I have spent 8 years alone because I could not figure out how to live in the world after that. I know what it is to be isolated, even if the reasons are different, and I know that I am tired of it." Lissa stared at him, her amber eyes searching, and Yannick let her look. He had no defense except honesty, no argument except the simple truth that he meant what he said even if he could not fully explain why. "1 month," Lissa said at last. "You may come here every 7th day evening for 1 month. We will talk, and I will watch how you are with Gretchen, and at the end of that time I will decide if we continue." She paused. "And if at any point I tell you to leave and not come back, you will respect that." "I will," Yannick promised. "And you will not make more grand declarations in public without speaking to me first," Lissa added, her voice sharp. "What you said in the village green, do you have any idea how terrifying that was? How much you complicated my life with a few words?" Yannick winced. "I do now, and I apologize. It was impulsive and arrogant, and I should have thought before I spoke." "Yes, you should have," Lissa agreed, but her voice had lost some of its edge, and when she looked at Gretchen her expression softened. "But I suppose your heart was in the right place." "I will do better," Yannick said. "I promise to think before I speak, and to consult you about anything that affects you and Gretchen." Lissa nodded, then stood and began clearing the bowls, a clear signal that the evening was ending. Yannick stood as well, and when Lissa walked him to the door he paused on the threshold and looked back at Gretchen, who was still sitting at the table. "Good night, Gretchen," he said gently. "I will see you next 7th day." "Good night, Yannick," Gretchen replied, and this time she did smile, a small, shy thing that made her look even younger. Yannick walked back through the village in the gathering dark, his heart lighter than it had been in years, and told himself not to hope too much. 1 month was not very long, and Lissa had every reason to be cautious, to test him and question him and hold him at arm's length until he proved himself worthy of trust. But he would prove it, he told himself. He would show up every 7th day, would be patient and kind and consistent, and he would earn the right to be part of their lives. It was a good plan, and a simple one, and Yannick had no way of knowing how much harder it would be than he imagined. The second seventh day, Yannick brought a bag of apples from the orchard at the edge of town and a small wooden puzzle he had bought from a traveling merchant. Gretchen's eyes lit up when she saw it, and she spent most of the evening working the pieces while Yannick and Lissa talked. Their conversation less awkward than the first visit, but still careful, both of them feeling out the boundaries of this strange new relationship. Lissa told him about her work at the grain house, the long hours sorting wheat and barley, the ache in her back by day's end, the small wages that were barely enough to cover rent and food. Yannick told her about the forge, about the satisfaction of shaping metal, about the customers who came with broken plows and worn horseshoes and sometimes, rarely, requests for something beautiful, a gate, a weather vane, a set of fireplace tools. "You enjoy it?" Lissa asked. "The work, I mean." Yannick considered. "It is honest work and it keeps me busy. I do not know if I would call it joy, but it is better than—" He stopped, not sure how much to share. "Better than what?" Lissa prompted. "Better than soldiering," Yannick said quietly. "Better than killing." Lissa was silent for a moment, her amber eyes steady on his face. Torvald said something similar once, that he fought because it was necessary, but that he dreamed of the day he could put down his sword and never pick it up again. Her voice went soft. "He never got that chance." "I am sorry," Yannick said, and meant it. "He sounds like he was a good man." He was. Lissa's hands twisted in her lap. "I worry sometimes that Gretchen will forget him. She was not born when he died, so she has no memories of her own, only the stories I tell her. What if that is not enough?" "Then you keep telling the stories," Yannick said. "And when she is older, you make sure she knows that having two fathers, one who gave her life and one who helped her live, it does not diminish either of them." Lissa looked at him with something like surprise, and Yannick realized he had just spoken as if his place in Gretchen's life was already assured, as if the month-long trial had already been passed. He started to apologize, but Lissa shook her head. "No, that was thank you. That was the right thing to say." On the third seventh day, Yannick arrived to find Gretchen waiting by the door, practically vibrating with excitement. "I learned a new song at school," she announced before he was even fully inside. "Do you want to hear it?" "Very much," Yannick said, and sat down while Gretchen sang a slightly off-key but enthusiastic rendition of a children's counting song. He applauded when she finished, and Gretchen beamed, her small tusks catching the firelight. Lissa watched from the hearth, her expression unreadable, and later, after Gretchen had gone to bed, she said quietly, "She does not usually warm to people this quickly." "Is that a problem?" Yannick asked. "I do not know yet," Lissa admitted. "Part of me is glad she is happy. Part of me is terrified that you will leave and break her heart." "I will not leave," Yannick said firmly. "Not unless you tell me to go." Lissa looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I am starting to believe that," she paused, "but belief is not the same as trust." "I know," Yannick said. "I will keep working to earn it." The fourth seventh day brought rain, a cold autumn downpour that turned the roads to mud and made Yannick arrive at the cottage soaked through despite his cloak. Lissa took one look at him and sighed, then handed him a towel and pointed to the hearth. "Dry off before you catch a chill." Yannick obeyed, standing close to the fire while water dripped from his hair and clothes. Gretchen watched him with concern, then disappeared behind the curtain to her mother's alcove and returned with a blanket. "Here," she said, holding it out. "Mama says blankets help when you are cold." Yannick took it, his throat suddenly tight, and wrapped it around his shoulders. "Thank you, Gretchen. That is very kind." Gretchen nodded seriously, then climbed into her chair at the table and picked up the wooden puzzle which she had been working on for weeks now. Yannick settled into his usual chair, the blanket still around his shoulders, and watched as she fit pieces together with careful concentration. "You are almost done," he observed. "There is one piece missing," Gretchen said, her small face scrunched in frustration. "I cannot find it anywhere." Yannick leaned over to look, and sure enough, there was a single gap in the otherwise complete picture of a farmhouse and field. "Sometimes pieces hide," he said. "Shall we search together?" They spent the next 20 minutes crawling around the cottage floor, looking under furniture and in corners, while Lissa prepared dinner and tried not to laugh at the sight of a grown man on his hands and knees searching for a bit of carved wood. Finally, Gretchen let out a triumphant shout and held up the missing piece, which had somehow ended up under her bed. "Found it," she crowed, and ran to the table to slot it into place. The puzzle was complete, the farmhouse whole, and Gretchen stood back with a look of such pure satisfaction that Yannick felt his heart squeeze. "Well done," he said warmly. "You worked hard on that." "I could not have finished it without your help," Gretchen said, very serious, and then, before Yannick could respond, she added, "Thank you for looking with me. My da would have done that, I think. Mama says he was patient." The words hung in the air, fragile and huge, and Yannick saw Lissa freeze at the hearth, her back to them. He looked at Gretchen, at her open, trusting face, and felt the weight of responsibility settle over him like iron. "I am glad I could help," he said quietly. "And yes, I think your da would have done exactly that." Gretchen smiled, then turned back to her puzzle, and Yannick met Lissa's eyes across the room. She was crying silently, tears streaming down her face, but when he started to stand, she shook her head and turned back to the hearth, her shoulders shaking. Yannick stayed where he was, giving her space to feel whatever she needed to feel, and told himself that this was progress, even if it hurt. After dinner, when Gretchen was asleep and Lissa walked him to the door, she said, "She is starting to see you as her father." "Is that all right?" Yannick asked. Lissa was silent for a long moment, her hand on the doorframe, her face turned away. "I do not know," she admitted. "It terrifies me. But I do not think I can stop it now, even if I wanted to." She looked at him, her amber eyes red-rimmed. "Do not make me regret this." "I will do everything in my power not to," Yannick promised. The first month ended and Lissa agreed to a second. Yannick continued to visit every 7th day, and slowly, carefully, the three of them began to fit together like pieces of Gretchen's puzzle. He learned that Lissa liked mint tea and hated onions, that she had a fierce sense of humor buried under layers of exhaustion and wariness, that she hummed while she cooked and had a lovely singing voice she almost never used. He learned that Gretchen was afraid of thunderstorms and loved stories about brave knights, that she was learning to read and struggled with her letters, that she had a talent for drawing and covered scraps of paper with sketches of birds and flowers. He learned, too, that being part of a family, even this tentative, fragile version of one, was harder than he had expected. There were evenings when he arrived to find Lissa exhausted and short-tempered, when Gretchen was fussy and tearful, when the cottage felt too small and the silence too heavy. There were moments when he said the wrong thing or failed to understand some unspoken need, when he felt useless and out of place, when he wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. But there were other moments, too. Moments when Gretchen climbed into his lap to show him a drawing, when Lissa laughed at something he said, and her whole face transformed, when the three of them sat around the table, and the conversation flowed easily and the cottage felt like home. Winter came, and with its shorter days and colder nights. Yannick started arriving earlier on 7th days, helping Lissa chop wood for the fire or mend a broken shutter. He brought extra food when he could afford it, a chicken from the butcher or a bag of turnips from the market, and tried not to notice the relief in Lissa's eyes when he did. He was not wealthy blacksmithing, paid decently, but not extravagantly. But he had no one to support except himself, and sharing his resources felt right in a way little else did. One evening in late autumn, perhaps 3 months after that first meeting in the village green, Yannick arrived to find Gretchen sitting at the table with her slate, tears of frustration streaming down her face as she tried to form letters. Lissa was at the hearth, her own face tight with stress, and when she saw Yannick she said, "She has a test tomorrow and she cannot remember how to spell anything, and I do not know how to help her." Yannick set down his bag and crossed to the table, kneeling beside Gretchen's chair. "What are you working on?" he asked gently. "Spelling words," Gretchen hiccuped. "But I keep forgetting them and the teacher gets angry and the other children laugh," and she dissolved into fresh sobs. Yannick looked at the slate, at the jumbled letters, and thought about the long hours he had spent as a boy learning his own letters, the way his father had patiently drilled him until the shapes made sense. "All right," he said. "Let us try something different. Instead of writing them all at once, let us make a game of it. I will say a word and you close your eyes and picture it in your mind, really see the letters. Then you open your eyes and write it down." Gretchen sniffled and nodded, and they worked together for the next hour, Yannick's voice calm and patient as he guided her through each word. By the end she was smiling again, her slate filled with correctly spelled words, and when Lissa came over to look she pressed a hand to her mouth and turned away quickly. Later at the door she said, "You are good with her, better than I expected." "I am trying," Yannick said simply. "I know." Lissa hesitated, then added, "I spoke to the mayor's wife last week. She asked if it was true that you were courting me." She laughed, a brittle sound. I did not know what to say. "Are you courting me?" Yannick blinked, surprised by the question. "I do not know," he admitted. "I thought I was focused on Gretchen, on proving I could be a father to her. I did not want to presume, so you are not interested in me," Lissa said flatly. "Only in her." "No, that is not," Yannick stopped, frustrated with his own clumsy words. "I am interested in you very much. I think you are brave and strong and beautiful, and he ran a hand through his hair. "I did not want to rush things. You said you needed time to trust me, so I was trying to be patient." Lissa stared at him, her amber eyes wide, and Yannick cursed himself for an idiot. Of course she would wonder. Of course she would need to know where they stood, and he had been so focused on proving himself as a father figure that he had failed to consider what it meant for the two of them. "I am interested," he said again, quieter, "but I will not push. We can take this as slowly as you need." Lissa was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said, "I am interested too, but I am also terrified, and I do not know how to reconcile those things." "We will figure it out," Yannick said. "Together." Lissa nodded slowly, then stepped back into the cottage and closed the door, and Yannick walked home through the cold autumn night wondering if he had just made things better or worse. The next few weeks were strange, charged with a new awareness that had not been there before. Yannick found himself noticing the way firelight caught in Lissa's hair, the curve of her smile, the strength in her hands. He caught her watching him sometimes, her gaze thoughtful, and the air between them felt electric in a way that was both exciting and terrifying. They did not speak of it directly, both of them too cautious, too aware of the stakes. But there were small moments a hand brushed against a hand, a smile held a beat too long, a conversation that drifted into something deeper and more personal. Yannick told her about his family, his parents dead, and his brother moved to a city 200 miles away, the loneliness of the years after the war. Lissa told him about her own family, orcs from the northern territories who had disowned her when she fell in love with Torvald, a half-orc who served in the king's army and died before he could make an honest woman of her. "I loved him," she said one evening, her voice quiet and raw. but part of me resented him too for leaving me alone, for dying before Gretchen was born. I know that is unfair, but I cannot help how I feel. Grief is not fair, Yannick said gently. Neither is love. Lissa looked at him, her eyes searching. Do you think you could love us, truly? Yannick's breath caught. It was too soon for that question, too much weight to place on a few months of seventh-day evenings, but he found himself answering honestly anyway. I think I am already halfway there. Lissa's eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table to take his hand, her grip warm and strong. They sat like that for a long moment, fingers intertwined, while the fire crackled and Gretchen slept peacefully in her bed, and the cottage felt for the first time like a place Yannick truly belonged. Winter deepened, and with it came challenges. Lissa fell ill with a fever that left her weak and shaking, unable to work for a week. Yannick took over, bringing food and firewood, sitting with Gretchen while Lissa slept, dosing her with willow bark tea and cool compresses. Gretchen was frightened, her small face pale with worry, and Yannick held her while she cried and promised that her mother would be all right. What if she is not? Gretchen whispered. What if she dies like my da did? She will not, Yannick said firmly, even though he was not sure, even though he could see how thin Lissa had become, how the fever burned in her cheeks. Your mother is strong and she has too much to live for. She will fight and she will win. And she did slowly, the fever breaking after 5 long days. When she was finally well enough to sit up and eat broth, she looked at Yannick with exhausted gratitude and said, You did not have to do all that. Yes, I did, Yannick said simply. You are important to me, both of you. Lissa's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, and when Yannick took her hand she did not pull away. The village noticed, of course. People talked, whispered behind hands, cast curious and sometimes hostile glances when Yannick walked through the market. The blacksmith and the orc woman, they said, shaking their heads. It was unnatural, improper, a scandal waiting to happen. Some customers stopped coming to the forge, taking their business to the smith in the next village over. Yannick noticed but did not comment, too focused on Lissa and Gretchen to care about the opinions of people who had never bothered to know them. But one afternoon, perhaps 6 months after that first meeting in the village green, a delegation came to the forge. 3 men, all respected members of the community, the mayor, the priest, and Aldrich, the wealthiest farmer in the region. They stood in the doorway, blocking the light, and Yannick set down his hammer and waited. We need to speak with you, the mayor said, his tone serious. Then speak, Yannick replied, crossing his arms. It is about the orc woman, Aldrich said bluntly. People are talking. They are saying you have taken up with her, that you are living in sin, that you are setting a poor example for the young people of the village. I visit her on seventh-day evenings, Yannick said, keeping his voice level. We share a meal and talk. I help with her daughter. If that is living in sin, then your definition needs work. You know what we mean, the priest said, his voice oily with false concern. It is not proper for a human man to associate so closely with an orc woman. What kind of message does that send? That people deserve kindness regardless of their race, Yannick suggested. That a child should not face the world alone. That love and family are more important than prejudice. He stepped forward and all 3 men took an involuntary step back. Or are those concepts too radical for you? Watch your tone, the mayor warned. We are not your enemies, Yannick. We are trying to help you see reason. If you wanted to help, you would have defended Gretchen when the children mocked her, Yannick said coldly. You would have ensured that Lissa received fair wages at the grain house instead of the pittance she is paid. You would have shown an ounce of compassion instead of coming here to lecture me about propriety. The priest's face darkened. You are being deliberately obstinate. We are simply pointing out that your association with this woman is causing discord in the community." "Then the community needs to examine its values," Yannick said, "because I have no intention of stopping." Aldrich stepped forward, his expression calculating. "What if we made it worth your while? Say, a contract for new tools for my farm, enough work to keep you busy all season. All you have to do is distance yourself from the orc woman and her child." Yannick stared at him, something cold and dangerous settling in his chest. "You want to bribe me to abandon a child? We want to help you see sense," Aldrich said smoothly. "She is not your responsibility. Let her mother care for her, or let them move to one of the orc settlements where they belong." Yannick's fist connected with Aldrich's jaw before he fully registered the decision to swing, and the man went down hard, blood streaming from his split lip. The mayor and the priest scrambled back, shouting, and Yannick stood over Aldrich with his fists clenched and his breath coming hard. "Get out," he said, his voice flat and cold. "All of you. And if you ever suggest that Gretchen does not belong here again, I will do worse than bloody your lip." The mayor helped Aldrich to his feet, both of them backing toward the door, and the priest pointed a shaking finger at Yannick. "You will regret this. Mark my words, you will regret this." "The only thing I regret," Yannick said, "is not punching him harder." They left, and Yannick stood alone in the forge, his hand throbbing, his heart pounding with adrenaline and fury. He had just made enemies of some of the most powerful men in the village, had probably ruined any chance of a peaceful life here, but he could not bring himself to care. He thought of Gretchen's face, of Lissa's exhausted smile, of the fragile family they were building, and knew he would do it again in a heartbeat. That evening, when he arrived at the cottage, he told Lissa what had happened. She listened in silence, her face growing paler with each word, and when he finished she stood abruptly and walked to the window, her back to him. "You should not have done that," she said, her voice shaking. "You should not have made enemies for us." "I did not make enemies for you," Yannick said quietly. "I made a choice to defend you. There is a difference." "Is there?" Lissa turned, her eyes bright with tears and anger. "Do you know what this means? They will make life harder for us, for Gretchen. They will find ways to punish us, to drive us out. You have made everything worse. Or I have drawn a line," Yannick said, standing. "I have made it clear that I will not tolerate cruelty or prejudice, and that anyone who wants to hurt you will have to go through me." "I do not need a protector," Lissa said, her voice rising. "I need," she stopped, her hands clenching into fists. "I need someone who thinks before he acts. I need someone who does not make grand, impulsive gestures that complicate my life." The words hit harder than Aldrich's face had hit Yannick's fist, and he took a step back, feeling like he had been slapped. "I thought I was doing the right thing." "You thought," Lissa said bitterly. "You did not ask me what I wanted, what I needed. You just decided, the same way you decided to declare yourself Gretchen's father in the middle of the village green. Do you have any idea how exhausting it is to live with someone who thinks he knows best?" Yannick opened his mouth, then closed it, because she was right. He had been impulsive, had acted without consulting her, and even though his intentions had been good, the result was the same. He had made her life harder without her consent. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "You are right. I should have thought, should have asked. I will do better." Lissa stared at him, her chest heaving, and then her face crumpled and she sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I am so tired," she whispered. "I am tired of fighting, tired of being afraid, tired of wondering if every good thing is going to be taken away." Yannick crossed to her slowly, kneeling beside her chair. "I know, and I am sorry for adding to your burdens, but I am not going anywhere, Lissa. No matter what the mayor or the priest or anyone else says, I am not leaving you." Lissa looked up, her face wet with tears. "How can you be so sure?" How can you promise that when everything is so hard? Because I love you, Yannick said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. I love you and Gretchen, and I want to build a life with you, and I do not care what anyone else thinks about it. Lissa's breath caught, her amber eyes wide, and for a long moment she just stared at him. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, fierce and desperate, her hands tangling in his hair. Yannick kissed her back, pouring everything he felt into it, the love and the fear and the desperate hope that this fragile thing they were building would survive. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lissa rested her forehead against his. I love you too, she whispered. I have for a while now. I was just too afraid to say it. Yannick cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. Then we will be afraid together, and we will figure this out one day at a time. Lissa nodded, then pulled him into another kiss, and this one was softer, sweeter, full of promise. The next few months were difficult. True to his word, Aldrich made trouble spreading rumors, convincing other villagers to shun Yannick's forge, even going so far as to report him to the regional magistrate for disturbing the peace. The magistrate, a board official who cared more about collecting taxes than village squabbles, dismissed the complaint after a brief investigation, but the damage was done. Yannick's business suffered, and there were weeks when he barely made enough to cover his own expenses, let alone help Lissa. But he kept visiting every seventh day, and slowly the visits became more. He started stopping by on Thursdays as well, then fifth days, until he was spending almost every evening at the cottage, helping with chores, playing with Gretchen, talking with Lissa long into the night. They were careful not to give the village more fodder for gossip. Yannick always left before full dark, always maintained propriety, but it was clear to anyone with eyes that they were building something real. Gretchen, for her part, bloomed under the attention. She grew more confident, more talkative, more willing to trust that good things could last. She started calling Yannick Da sometime around the 8-month mark, the words slipping out casually one evening as she asked him to pass the bread, and Yannick had to excuse himself to the doorway to hide the fact that he was crying. Lissa found him there, her hand gentle on his shoulder. Are you all right? She called me Da, Yannick managed, his voice rough. I know. Lissa's voice was soft. Is that all right? I can tell her not to if it makes you uncomfortable. No, Yannick said quickly, turning to face her. It is more than all right, it is. He stopped, overwhelmed. It is everything. Lissa smiled, her eyes shining, and kissed him gently. Then I suppose we should make it official. Yannick pulled back, staring at her. What do you mean? I mean, Lissa said carefully, that if you are going to be her father, it should be legal. There is a ceremony, a hearth adoption rite. It is old, not commonly used anymore, but it is binding. If you went through it, Gretchen would be your daughter in the eyes of the law as well as the heart. She paused. And traditionally, the rite is performed by the child's parents, both of them. Which would mean marriage, Yannick finished, his heart pounding. You are asking me to marry you. I am saying that if we are going to do this, we should do it properly, Lissa said, her cheeks flushing green. I am saying that I want Gretchen to have a family, a real one, and she took a breath. I want to be your wife if you will have me. Yannick stared at her, this fierce, beautiful woman who had let him into her life despite every reason to keep him out, and felt something settle into place, some final piece of the puzzle clicking home. Yes, he said simply. Yes, I will have you. I will marry you and adopt Gretchen and spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice. Lissa laughed, a breathless, joyful sound, and kissed him again. And when they finally pulled apart, Gretchen was standing in the doorway, watching them with wide eyes. Are you getting married? She asked, her voice hushed with wonder. Yes, Lissa said, holding out her hand. "Is that all right with you?" Gretchen ran to them, throwing her arms around Yannick's waist, and when she looked up her face was radiant. "Does that mean you will really be my da forever?" "Forever," Yannick promised, kneeling so he was eye level with her, "if you will have me." "I will," Gretchen said solemnly, and then grinned. "I will have you for always." They married in the spring. A small ceremony at the cottage with only a handful of guests, the few villagers who had remained kind, a traveling priest who did not care about species, and Gretchen, dressed in a new green dress that Lissa had sewn herself. Yannick wore his best clothes and felt absurdly nervous, his hands shaking as he took Lissa's and spoke his vows. "I promise to stand by you in all things," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion churning inside him. "To be a partner in joy and hardship, to honor you and Gretchen, and to build a life worthy of the trust you have placed in me." Lissa's vows were simpler. "I promise to let you in, even when I am afraid, to trust you with my heart and my daughters, to love you today and always." The priest pronounced them wed, and Yannick kissed his wife while Gretchen cheered, and the small gathering applauded. It was not a grand ceremony, not the kind of wedding that would be talked about for years, but it was perfect in its simplicity, in the way it bound three lives together into something new and strong. After the wedding, they held the hearth adoption rite. It was an old tradition, one Lissa had learned from her grandmother, involving fire and bread and spoken vows. Yannick and Lissa stood on either side of the hearth while Gretchen stood between them, and together they spoke the words that would make her his daughter-in-law as well as love. "I, Yannick Barrow, take this child as my own," Yannick said, his hand on Gretchen's shoulder. "I promise to provide for her, to protect her, to guide her, and to love her as my own flesh and blood. From this day forward, she is my daughter and I am her father." Gretchen looked up at him, her amber eyes shining, and said the words Lissa had taught her. "I, Gretchen Joran, accept this man as my father. I promise to honor him, to listen to him, and to love him. From this day forward, he is my da and I am his daughter." The priest marked their foreheads with ash from the hearth, a symbol of the fire that bound them, and then it was done. Gretchen was legally and spiritually Yannick's daughter, and the little family of three was complete. The celebration that followed was small but joyful, with food and drink and laughter that filled the cottage. Gretchen showed off her new surname, Gretchen Barrow, writing it carefully on her slate, and Yannick felt his heart swell with pride every time he heard it. As the evening wore on and the guests departed, Yannick found himself standing outside the cottage, looking up at the stars. Lissa joined him, slipping her hand into his, and they stood in comfortable silence for a long moment. "I never thought I would have this," Lissa said quietly. "A husband, a whole family, a future that looked like something other than survival." "Neither did I," Yannick admitted. "I thought I was done, that the war had taken everything I had to give. But then I saw a little girl crying in the mud and he stopped, trying to find the right words. I found a reason to matter again." "You matter," Lissa said fiercely, turning to face him. "You matter to me and to Gretchen, and you always will." Yannick pulled her close, kissing the top of her head, and felt the last of the old loneliness finally release its grip on his heart. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. Yannick moved into the cottage, bringing his tools and his few possessions, and the space that had once felt cramped now felt cozy, full of warmth and laughter and the ordinary chaos of family life. Business at the forge slowly improved as people saw that the marriage was real and lasting, that Yannick was not going to be swayed by gossip or prejudice. Some customers never returned, but new ones came, travelers and merchants who did not care about his wife's green skin, and eventually the forge was busier than it had been before. Lissa continued her work at the grain house, though Yannick tried to convince her to quit. "You do not have to work yourself to exhaustion anymore," he pointed out. "I make enough for all of us." "I know," Lissa said, "but I like having my own income, my own independence. It makes me feel like I am contributing." Yannick understood, even if he worried about her health, and so they found a compromise. Lissa cut her hours to part-time, giving her more time at home with Gretchen while still maintaining the work she valued. Gretchen thrived. She did better in school, her confidence growing as she no longer had to face the other children's mockery alone. When bullies tried to start trouble, Gretchen would simply say, "My da is the blacksmith, and he said if you have a problem you can discuss it with him." And most of the children decided they did not, in fact, have a problem after all. But more than that, Gretchen seemed happier, more settled, as if some fundamental fear had been laid to rest. She laughed more, played more, brought friends home from school, other children who did not care that she was an orc, who just wanted to play games and share snacks and giggle over silly things. Watching her, Yannick felt a fierce satisfaction that went beyond pride, a deep certainty that he had done something profoundly right. The first year of marriage passed, then the second. They celebrated Gretchen's 8th birthday with a small party, inviting her school friends and baking a cake that turned out lopsided but delicious. They celebrated Yannick and Lissa's first anniversary with a quiet dinner after Gretchen went to bed, talking late into the night about their hopes and dreams and the future they were building. "I want more children," Lissa admitted one evening, her head resting on Yannick's shoulder as they sat by the fire. "I always wanted Gretchen to have siblings, but I thought it was impossible. Now it is not," Yannick finished. He turned to look at her, his heart full. "I would like that too. I would like a house full of children and noise and chaos." Lissa laughed, the sound warm and content. "Be careful what you wish for." But Yannick was not careful, and he did not regret it when, 9 months later, Lissa gave birth to a daughter with green skin and Yannick's dark eyes. They named her Giselle, and Gretchen was beside herself with joy, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to bedtime songs. "I am a big sister now," she announced to anyone who would listen. "I have to take care of her." And she did, with a fierce devotion that made Yannick's heart ache. He watched his older daughter rock his younger daughter to sleep, watched her carefully spell out stories for the baby who could not yet understand, watched her grow into the role of protector and teacher, and he knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, this family would face them together. Life was not perfect. There were still people in the village who disapproved, still whispers and sideways glances when they walked through the market. Aldrich continued to make trouble when he could, though his influence had waned after Yannick's business not only survived but thrived. The priest preached sermons about the sanctity of racial purity, thinly veiled condemnations that made Lissa's jaw tight and Yannick's blood boil. But they learned to ignore it, to focus on the life they were building rather than the opinions of small-minded people. And there were still hard days, days when Lissa was exhausted and Yannick was frustrated and Gretchen was difficult, and baby Giselle would not stop crying. Days when money was tight and tempers were shorter and they snapped at each other over small things. But they learned to apologize, to forgive, to remember that they were on the same side, that the love they shared was stronger than any momentary conflict. 2 years after Giselle was born, Lissa became pregnant again, and this time they had a son dark-haired and green-skinned, with Yannick's broad shoulders and Lissa's fierce eyes. They named him Oren, and he was loud and energetic from the moment he entered the world, demanding attention and giving affection in equal measure. Gretchen was 10 by then, old enough to be genuinely helpful, and she took her role as eldest sibling seriously, helping to feed and change and entertain her younger siblings. She was growing into a remarkable young woman. Yannick thought with pride, smart and kind and brave, the kind of person who stood up for those weaker than herself, who defended the outcasts and befriended the lonely. "She learned that from you," Lissa said one evening, watching Gretchen play with Oren in the small yard behind their cottage. They had expanded over the years, adding a second room for the children and a small workshop where Yannick could do minor repairs without walking all the way to the forge. "She learned it from both of us," Yannick corrected. "You taught her to be fierce. I just taught her how to use that fierceness to protect others." Lissa leaned against him, and they stood together in the fading light, watching their children play. Giselle was trying to build a tower out of wooden blocks while Oren knocked them down. Giggling, and Gretchen was attempting to mediate the conflict with mixed success. "I never thought I would have this," Lissa said quietly, echoing words she had spoken years ago. "A husband who loves me, children who are safe and happy, a home that feels like more than just survival." "Neither did I," Yannick admitted. "But I am grateful every day that I saw a little girl crying in the mud and decided to do something about it." "We are grateful too," Lissa said, turning to kiss him. "More than you know." They stood there a while longer, wrapped in each other's arms, watching their children and the life they had built, and Yannick felt a peace so profound it was almost painful. He had been a soldier once, had killed and seen death, had spent years believing he had nothing left to give. But he had been wrong. He had found a family, had become a father and a husband, and in doing so he had found himself again. The years continued to pass, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. Gretchen grew into a teenager, still fierce, but now with a teenager's moodiness and occasional sullen silences. Yannick learned to navigate this new phase with patience, remembering his own difficult adolescence, and Lissa proved remarkably adept at knowing when to push and when to give space. Giselle was 6 and Oren 4 when Lissa announced she was pregnant once more, and this time they had another daughter, tiny and delicate with Yannick's features softened into something almost ethereal. They named her Olive, and she was the quietest of the children, content to watch and observe where her siblings charged ahead. The cottage was bursting at the seams now, and Yannick began plans to build a proper house, something larger that could accommodate their growing family. It took 2 years of saving and planning, of working extra hours at the forge and taking on commissions he would normally have refused, but eventually they had enough. He bought a plot of land at the edge of the village, near the forest, and over the course of a year, he and several hired workers built a sturdy 2-story house with 4 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a workshop attached to the side. The day they moved in, Lissa cried happy tears, and Gretchen, now 14 and trying very hard to seem grown up, allowed herself to be excited about having her own room for the first time in her life. The younger children ran through the empty space, their laughter echoing off the new walls, and Yannick stood in the doorway with his arm around Lissa and felt like he had finally given them something worthy of the trust they had placed in him all those years ago. "This is perfect," Lissa whispered. Thank you," Yannick replied, "for giving me a reason to build it." They settled into the new house and life found a new rhythm. Yannick's forge was now only a short walk away, and he found he could spend more time at home, more time with his children and wife. Gretchen began helping at the forge on weekends, showing an aptitude for metalwork that surprised and delighted him. Giselle loved books and spent hours reading anything she could get her hands on. Oren was fascinated by animals and kept bringing home injured birds and stray cats, insisting they needed help. Olive, quiet Olive, had a talent for drawing and covered every available surface with sketches of her family and the world around her. They were happy, Yannick thought. Truly, deeply happy in a way he had never imagined possible. When Gretchen was 16, she came to him one evening with a serious expression and asked to talk. They sat on the porch of the new house, looking out over the darkening fields, and Yannick waited for her to find her words. "I have been thinking about my other father," Gretchen said at last. "Torvald, the one who died before I was born." Yannick's heart clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "What about him?" "Mama told me stories, but I do not really know him," Gretchen said quietly. "And I was wondering, do you think it is wrong that I think of you as my father? Like I am betraying his memory?" Yannick was silent for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "I think," he said at last, "that a person can have more than one father, one who gave you life and one who helped you live it. Both can be real, both can matter without diminishing either." "But I do not remember him," Gretchen said, her voice small. "I only remember you." "That is not your fault," Yannick said gently, "and I do not think Torvald would mind. From what your mother has told me, he was a good man who wanted his daughter to be happy and safe. I think he would be glad you have someone to protect you and love you, even if that someone is not him." Gretchen was quiet, her amber eyes thoughtful. Then she said, "Thank you, for being my da, for choosing us when you did not have to." "Thank you for letting me," Yannick replied, his throat tight, "for giving me a chance to be part of your life." Gretchen leaned against his shoulder, and they sat together in comfortable silence while the stars came out one by one. And Yannick thought about the choices that had led him here. The single impulsive decision to kneel in the mud beside a crying child and speak words that bound him to a family he had not yet known he needed. He did not regret a single moment. More years passed, and the children continued to grow. Gretchen became a skilled blacksmith, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day work at the forge so Yannick could focus on more complex commissions. She was serious and dedicated, with a talent for the work that rivaled his own, and Yannick felt a fierce pride every time he watched her shape metal with confident, practiced hands. Giselle proved to have a gift for teaching, and began helping the village schoolmaster with the younger children, her patience and kindness making her a favorite among the students. Oren apprenticed with the village healer, his love for animals translating into a talent for caring for the sick and injured. Olive continued to draw, her sketches becoming more detailed and beautiful with each passing year, and she began selling her work at the market, small portraits and landscapes that brought in a surprising amount of coin. Lissa, for her part, had long since stopped working at the grain house, devoting herself instead to managing the household and occasionally helping Gretchen at the forge. She was in her 40s now, still beautiful but with threads of silver in her black hair, laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of years of joy and struggle in equal measure. And Yannick, now past 50, felt the weight of age in his joints and the weariness in his bones, but he also felt a contentment that transcended physical discomfort. He had lived a full life, had built something good and lasting, had loved and been loved in return. One evening, sitting on the porch with Lissa while their grown children laughed and talked inside, Yannick said, "Do you remember the day we met? How could I forget?" Lissa replied, a smile playing at her lips. "You made a grand, impulsive declaration in the middle of the village green and terrified me half to death." "I was an idiot," Yannick said fondly. "You were," Lissa agreed, "but you were also brave and kind and you kept your promise. You became her father and my husband, and you gave us a life I never thought possible." "We gave each other a life," Yannick corrected. "I was just as lost as you were, just as alone. We found each other and we built something together." Lissa took his hand, her grip still strong after all these years. "I love you, Yannick Barrow, today and always." "I love you too," Yannick said, "today and always." They sat together in the gathering dark, watching the lights come on in the house, listening to the sound of their children's voices, and Yannick thought about the journey that had brought them here. It had started with a child crying in the mud, with a spontaneous decision to kneel and speak words he barely understood, and it had led to this: a family, a home, a life full of love and purpose and meaning. He had been a soldier once, and then a lonely blacksmith, and now he was a father and a husband and a part of something larger than himself. The transformation had not been easy or quick, had required years of patience and work and learning to trust and be trusted, but it had been worth every difficult moment. Gretchen came out onto the porch then, now a woman of 23, strong and capable and beautiful in the way her mother was beautiful, with that same fierce dignity and bright intelligence. She sat down beside Yannick, and after a moment, Giselle and Oren and Olive joined them, crowding onto the porch, and Lissa went inside to bring out tea and bread. They sat together as a family, talking and laughing as the night deepened, and Yannick looked around at the faces of his wife and children and felt a gratitude so profound it was almost overwhelming. This was what he had fought for, what he had worked for, what he had chosen when he knelt in the mud beside a crying 6-year-old and declared himself her father. This was family. This was home. This was love, and it was everything. The moon rose full and bright over the fields, casting silver light over the house, and the family gathered on its porch. And Yannick Barrow, blacksmith and father and husband, knew with absolute certainty that he had found exactly where he belonged. Years later, when his hair was fully gray and his hands were gnarled with age, Yannick would sit in the same spot and watch his grandchildren play in the yard. Gretchen's children, a boy and 2 girls with mixed human and orc features, beautiful and fierce and full of life. He would hold Lissa's hand, her skin more wrinkled now but still the same deep green he loved, and they would talk about the life they had built, the family they had created, the love that had sustained them through all the difficult years. And sometimes, when the light hit just right and the laughter of children filled the air, Yannick would remember that day in the village green, would remember the small girl with tears streaming down her face, and he would think about the moment he had made a choice that changed everything. He had knelt beside an orc child and said she had a father now, and in doing so he had found his own salvation, his own purpose, his own path home. It had taken years to make those impulsive words true, years of patience and work and learning to be worthy of the trust placed in him. But he had done it. He had become a father, not through blood but through choice, and that choice had given him everything that mattered in the end. Love was not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations, though those had their place. Love was about showing up, day after day, year after year, and proving through actions that the words spoken in a moment of impulse were backed by a lifetime of commitment. Yannick had shown up. He had kept his promise. And the little girl who had cried in the mud had grown into a remarkable woman, strong and skilled and kind, who called him Da and meant it with every fiber of her being. That, Yannick thought, was worth more than all the gold in the kingdom. As the sun set on another day, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, the family gathered once more around the table for dinner. Lissa served stew, just like that first nervous evening years ago, and the house filled with the sounds of conversation and laughter and the ordinary chaos of people who loved each other. Yannick looked around the table at his wife, his children, his grandchildren, and felt his heart swell with a joy so complete it was almost painful. This was his legacy, Not the swords he had once wielded or the metal he had shaped, but the family he had chosen and the love he had cultivated. He had been a soldier and then a blacksmith, and now he was simply a man who had loved and been loved in return, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.